Hello and welcome to the programme which brings together some of the country's leading columnists, BBC specialists and the foreign correspondents writing, blogging and broadcasting to audiences back home from the Dateline London. This week, a valedictory visit from Angela Merkel, species decline and why it's worth trying to stop it, and how do you live with a centenarian planning to be around for another 100 years? Joining us this week, Yasmin Alibaya-Brown is an award-winning newspaper columnist in the UK. Thomas Keelinger has been reporting and explaining the British to audiences in his native Germany for decades. He's also an historian. And with me in the studio is the BBC's Chief Environment Correspondent, Justin Rowlett. A warm welcome to all of you. Good to have you with us. Now, like all political leaders who pre-announced their departure, Angela Merkel's influence has been in decline ever since. Two recent rebuffs within the European Union, her proposal for an EU-Russia summit seen off by Poland and the Baltic states, and her suggestion that British visitors, vaccinated or not, should be quarantined. The German Chancellor was in the UK Friday. Instead of quarantine, there was tea with the Queen. Thomas, Chancellor Merkel suggested that vaccinate Brits after she had her meeting with Boris Johnson might, after all, soon get as warm a welcome as she received in Britain on Friday. Has her influence been declining for some time? And is that simply because she'd pre-announced that she was going, or is her kind of very cautious, deliberative style of politics just going a bit out of fashion in Germany?
Well, of course, anyone who announces the day of his departure in power is automatically converting himself or herself into a lame duck, as we call it. So you don't expect too much influence from someone like Angela Merkel, who, after 16 years, has relinquished power and will leave the stage in September. You describe her as cautious and slow-moving policies, but you know, when you look at her record, the two most important decisions she took in her time in office was really like lightning overnight, taking off her own bat, opening the borders for refugees, millions of them to Germany, and moving off atomic energy. She decided on these issues without much consultation or advise anyone. This is why I am so sorry that today, when she met Boris Johnson, the two of them didn't have the guts to seize the mettle and come up with a joint declaration to say Britons who are doubly vaccinated can, of course, travel without a hassle in Europe. And Johnson could have said, and those who come from amber countries and have been doubly vaccinated have to be tested, but they won't have to go back into quarantine. They missed this opportunity. I mean, she talks about a new resetting of relations between Germany and Britain. But the one moment of glory, like a footballer missing this great chance, Thomas Müller, to score the goal, they missed it. You know, and she can't get herself to even announce such a step. She was willing overnight to allow millions of people to come to Germany. And she failed to come with a statement to say, yes, as from next week, Britons can travel without worry about quarantine when they're twice vaccinated. So this is exactly the Angela Merkel. She is contradictory in her decision-making. The jury is out what kind of place in history she will have. I wonder whether it will be altogether a very favourable one. Don't forget, she only relied on the coalition partner, the Social Democrats, to govern for 16 years on her own. She wouldn't have been able to do it. So there's a mixed bag when you look at her record.
I want to pick up what you mentioned about Fukushima with Justin in a moment, but Yasmin first. How damaging do you think longer term to the EU was it her kind of sticking with the orthodoxy of German tradition and saying back during the financial crisis, no, we're not going to share debt across the Eurozone. We're going to, individual countries will have to deal with the problem themselves, because it seemed to be not her, but in the end, Mario Draghi at the central bank who saved the euro. And meantime, you had countries like Spain and Greece who had to deal with some pretty austere and difficult times.
I'm sorry, Sean and Thomas, I'm not going to go with you on this. I'm appalled, actually. Two men slagging off the first female German chancellor, who's, as Christine Lagarde said, a unique and special woman who combined, yes, meticulous thought and consideration with some pretty daring policies. Of course, in Greece, you know, there is this feeling that it's because of her they went through this terrible crisis. But, you know, the EU isn't just Angela Merkel. And I think what she has achieved in these years, a young woman from Eastern Germany, who came over and has kept Germany steady through it all. In the 2008 crisis, Germany did not suffer as so many other countries did, because the EU isn't one nation. Each nation has its own capacities and distinction. I've just been talking to 32 British people who have taken out German citizenship. There's been a 2,000% increase in those. And in a way, they're the equivalent of Thomas, if you like. They love Germany. They love Merkel. So I wanted to say that because I'm not going to, go on this fairly destructive train of thought you've taken up.
No.
Now, for your particular question, yes, I think Germany and Italy during that crisis, maybe the entire EU should have been more, kind or considerate. The taking in of the refugees was an astonishingly brave move. And on the whole, it has worked. So I totally admire her, and that will not be shaken.
OK, Justin, just on the question then of Fukushima, we talked about Fukushima, and Thomas mentioned it, that was a dramatic decision. Fukushima nuclear explosion with all the terrible consequences of that and the fears of what might come as a result of that. She immediately announced, pretty much immediately, we're shutting down the civilian nuclear programme in Germany. That had consequences, didn't it?
It's got
energy consequences and political ones.
It certainly has. It was very dramatic. And I'm sorry, Yasmin, I'm going to be a little bit critical of Angela Merkel here.
Men.
No, let's just look at the statistics for nuclear power in Germany. So Germany's largest nuclear plant, the second largest nuclear plant in the world in terms of production, produced 11.5 terawatts of power in 2018. That's trillion watts, huge amount of power. By comparison, all of Denmark's wind turbines, 6,100 of them, produce just a little bit more power. So what we're talking about, this one plant is a huge supplier of energy to Germany. What does it mean taking that out? Because it will now be closed next year, 2022, it's going to be closed. It could have gone on for a couple of decades, all the way, people estimate, to 2048. So they're taking that component out of their power system. What does it mean? Well, it means they're much more dependent on gas and more dependent on coal. In fact, Germany is not going to phase out coal under current plans until 2038. Britain is getting rid of its last coal-fired power station in 2024. So it's going to be really hard for Germany to meet its climate goals if it sticks with this policy of taking out nuclear power. And yes, it also makes it much more dependent on Russia. We've got Nord Stream 2 coming online, much more dependent on Russia, much less flexibility in its foreign policy. So, I think it's hard to argue that certainly from an environmental perspective, that has been good for Germany.
Thomas, just on the question then of relations with Russia, is this a really worrying cleavage within the EU, do you think?
Well, I dare not go on after Yasmin condemned me so totally with what I said before. I just want to put the record straight. I have no intention of slagging her off as a male chauvinist pig, as it were. I don't know. I have nothing against her, except that I say there is a mediocrity involved in some of the things, and the male heir apparent who is likely to follow her will follow in her footsteps. There's not going to be much of a revolution going on. So she steadied the boat. Germans like to do things traditionally, steady as it goes, and she is the ultimate ideal representative of a very cautiously moving society. About Russia, of course, she was rather ill-advised, together with Macron, to launch this initiative, a new high-level dialogue with Russia at this very moment. No wonder some countries, first of all Poland, objected to it, that you should award Russia for a Crimean occupation, which has still not been dealt with properly, with human rights violations and so forth. So that was an ill-considered step, which doesn't completely wipe her off, as it were, the foreign policy expertise. But she is, like so many other people, full of ideas which sometimes work, sometimes don't work. And this one did not work. No, I don't think she is going to be a prominent voice in opening up a new dialogue with Russia. That may have to wait rather longer.
Yasmin, just on that question then of what happens now in Europe, Thomas mentioned Macron. He has his reform ideas for the EU kind of didn't really get much traction among other EU members. He will now be distracted, presumably, for the next 12 months, trying to hold on to the Elysee Palace. Angela Merkel will be gone in September. German politics will change, even if a lot of it will stay the same. Another coalition, possibly with the CDU and other partners, maybe including the Greens. Who's left to lead in Europe?
Well, I mean, one has to remember one of the things about the EU. It isn't one nation, although that's the narrative that's dominated in Britain for God knows how long. That it isn't all Germany or Germany and France. You know, this isn't a coalition, a club of nations. The future will be different from the past, and as Thomas says, in a way, that's politics. That's you know how society changes. What I fear, though, is that Merkel's steadiness. You know, there was a 2020 survey done of the EU countries, and in 14 nations, 75% trusted her personally. Now, the incoming person will have to work very hard to get to that level of trust. So that it's always difficult when somebody has left behind quite a legacy. Secondly, one doesn't know. I mean, I completely agree about the whole Russia dialogue with Russia thing, but a lot is happening thanks to Putin and his ambitions, and the EU will have to come up with a collective response. Eventually they're good at that. So I have great faith in the EU. I'm always going to be loyal to it, though I'm no longer part of it, that they do things in a reasonable way. They're not as shouty as we are. It will be fine, but it will take work.
Yasmin, thank you very much. Now, grandiose statements, lacking teeth, and devoid of effective delivery mechanisms. That's the verdict of a committee of MPs examining the British government's plans to protect biodiversity. We think having lots of different species of insects, say, or plants matters, but in truth we're not sure why. Still, the risk is clear. The UK, the Environmental Audit Committee reported this week, is one of the most nature-depleted countries on Earth. 15% of its species are under threat. It's probably helpful, Justin, first of all, wearing your environment hat, if we define terms. What do we mean by biodiversity, and what is it the committee means by saying 15% of species in the UK are under threat?
Let's start with what biodiversity is. Biodiversity refers to the incredible variety of life on Earth. So it's biological diversity. It represents all the different species on Earth, so animals, plants, fungi, insects, bacteria, the whole shebang. We're talking, and this is the point, we don't actually know the range of species on Earth. So we know we think there's about 1.7 million species of animals, plants and fungi, but we don't know for sure. In fact, some scientists say there could be as many as 8 or 9 million different species. Bring in bacteria, you're in a whole world of of diversity, because a single spoonful of soil can have as many as 10,000 different bacteria, more, on some estimates. So we don't know what we're doing as we get rid of species. And let's have a look at, the level of threat there is to species. So we know that the rate of extinction is far higher than it would be without humanity. We think that 25% of mammals are a threat of extinction, 41% of amphibians, and about 17% of birds. So a huge kind of pressure, extinction pressure. We don't understand the subtle kind of processes, as you alluded to in your introduction, that of how ecosystems work. We do know that in some cases you take one species out, the whole thing changes. So the whole balance of species changes. So as we get rid of species, as species die away, we don't know what consequences that's going to have. And it could have catastrophic consequences. So, the increasing reduction in diversity could have, just like climate change, a catastrophic effect on the ability of the Earth to support us. Because let's just remember, these ecosystems are the source of fresh air, they're the source of food, they're the source of clean water, they are the basis. We sit within this web of life, and we depend on these on biodiversity to deliver us, which rather crudely in economic terms are referred to as services. That's why it's so important, and that's why the uncertainty around it is also important. We can't say whether, we don't know what's going to happen if we get rid of, certain bacteria, for example, or even, mosquitoes, for example, which everybody seems to, we treat as if they're, necessarily vermin. They are the basis of, they feed all sorts of other animals, which in turn are food for society, etc., etc., etc. It's complex and difficult and dangerous to play with the balance of species in the world.
And it's the challenge then for politicians, Yasmin, is to kind of come up with effective ways of maintaining this biodiversity. And the government, to be fair to it, as the committee says, there's some very ambitious targets, but targets been put into law, which the committee wants, but we've had targets on things like child poverty, and then it turns out that actually what happens when you have a target in law when it's failed to meet it, broken? You don't drag the Prime Minister off and stick him in jail. So, I mean, in a sense, there's a difficulty here, isn't there, between matching ambition with credibility?
Yes, and it's, as the committee said, grandiose statements, superficial strategies, some completely counterproductive policies which are more about exploiting nation even now, a very kind of 18th and 19th century kind of man-centered, if you like, view of the natural world. And it's still going on. And in a way, I worry that, all the right things are being said, but the kind of aggressive capitalism of our times is deeply uninterested in these very important things that have just been said so evocatively by a correspondent about the natural world, about balance, about biodiversity, about all our futures. Those two are enemies, and I don't think, I feel this government is taking any of this seriously, but they know what to say, and they might tinker and they might make promises, but they're about as empty as the promises that our Prime Minister has made to the whole world and to whoever, yeah? So I think we have to take it seriously.
Thomas, the challenge is integrating this into all the policy you make, isn't it? Whether it's planning policy, whether it's how you subsidise agriculture or fisheries. I mean, do you get a sense that this is something that, there's a lot of attention on climate change, which is, again, big, grand, dramatic, that this kind of quite detailed, subtle, some might say even quite boring policy making actually doesn't generate enough attention, whether it's from the media or from politicians themselves, or indeed from the voters, to sustain policy change?
Well, maybe the reason why it doesn't demand so much attention is that we've left out one important factor in all this debate so far, and that is population. The greed of ever-growing population development on the earth is tending towards not just capitalism, as Yasmin said, but the basic needs of feeding, eating, and using arable lands for their purposes, irrespective of the damage they do to the ecological system. So I think we have to find a consensus, also with China in particular, as we're talking about when is the level, when is the breaking point reached in terms of world population. 9 billion we are already. We are looking down the barrel. We are coming to the moment of crisis. If we go much beyond that, whatever we do politically to save individual species, we have to attach ourselves to the need for 9 billion and more people to do damage to the natural habitat. Something has to give. As Johnson so rightfully said, when the day of execution is near, you concentrate the mind. And this is what we need to do. We need to concentrate the mind, what more than 9 billion people are likely to do to the earth if they just continue to multiply without any thought about the future danger to the ecological surroundings. So I think I would definitely bring the population issue into this whole debate.
Thomas, thank you very much. One wonders what would have happened if we'd maintain species diversity for humans as well and still had Neanderthals around with us.
Right.
Now, for the last 12 of the 16 years that Angela Merkel has been in charge in Germany, Xi Jinping has been running China. Having abolished term limits, there's every reason to think he'll be in power for many years more. Chinese do longevity, something demonstrated in Thursday's choreographed display of popular euphoria marking the centenary of the Chinese Communist Party. Asked by an interviewer whether it will still exist in another 100 years, the exiled artist Ai Weiwei observed dryly, Chinese dynasties very often last 200 or 300 years. Whether they do or not, Jasmine, the reality is we have to live with and operate with China as a very real presence in the world. In terms of other countries looking at China, working with China, there was a belief 20 years ago that, well, as China becomes more capitalist, its politics will change too. That clearly hasn't happened. What do we do now? How do we sustain an effective relationship without conceding the things we believe in?
It's a really important question. I don't think anyone has the answer to that. The power of China is very quiet, actually. It's very quiet, not only in terms of Hong Kong, which we get a lot of coverage of, but, I went to Uganda, my old country, a couple of years ago, and every single infrastructure project is being run by the Chinese in Uganda, in Tanzania, across Southern Africa. And they do sign these agreements with the leaders where, in exchange for this influence and extraordinary, untrammeled influence across Africa, they will do this infrastructure work. They don't even use the local labor. As one of the people I met there, the local people said, they don't even use us to clean. And so it's happening. It's a world power. It's certainly economically controlling a huge amount of world space, but its values and its politics are deeply unappealing to most people around the world who are Democrats. I just don't know where it's going to take us. India has the capacity still to resist this Chinese megalomaniac ambitions. But I don't know for how long. It is a very serious issue.
Justin, you were a correspondent in India. India is, yes, it has a strong leader in Mr. Modi, Narendra Modi, but it has a very noisy, messy, but genuinely kind of plural political system. How does it respond to its neighbour, its big, potentially aggressive neighbour?
I was there when there were a couple of these cross-border skirmishes between the Indians and the Chinese, and that geographical position of India and China, I think, is very important in this debate. India has a huge, long border through the Himalayas with China. It's very close to China. China is a much bigger economy, about 5 times the size of India. It's a very big and very strong neighbour. India's had a long history of not playing a big role in international affairs. It was one of the key players in the non-aligned movement, you'll probably remember. So this is a great tradition of India's not kind of
not taking sides,
not playing a game of setting up alliances. And you can imagine with that huge long border, siding with America against China might be a very uncomfortable position. But you're absolutely right that India feels very uncomfortable. It feels circled by all those countries, just as Yasmin saw in Africa, that are being all sorts of road and infrastructure projects are being funded by China as part of Belt and Road. It feels encircled, but it has this aversion to building alliances. So it's in an uncomfortable position. And I think the thing about India we should remember is it is an inward-looking country, but it's building a very strong and big economy. And in the future multipolar world, it looks very bipolar at the moment, but in the future multipolar world, India should be an important pole of that. And I think India's kind of waiting a long game to build itself up before it kind of asserts itself on the international stage.
Thomas.
Yeah, well, I think, as Jasmine said, what the Chinese are up to in Africa and how they help the development there, I'm rather relaxed about. Why? It's a country with a huge surplus of people, of billions of people who have, talents to play with and to use. And so they do it in the world over. Yes, they're buying influence for China in a sort of non-offensive way. My concern is when China will determine to use her influence and her power and her bigness, as it were, to militarily make inroads in the balance of power in the Southeast Asia seas. And I've watched with interest how Biden has now conducting this week maritime maneuvers with Japan in and around Taiwan, because obviously after Hong Kong has so shamefully virtually lost its freedom to the Chinese inroads into the liberty and libertarian system, the next, as it were, appetizing becoming a victim is likely to be Taiwan for China, who have never recognized Taiwan as an independent country and consider it part of their mainland. So there you have to be careful.
Justin, one last thought, a brief thought if you can. I mean, presumably all this involvement around the world has potential, doesn't it? President Xi has recognised the danger of climate change. It might be possible to get him to harness that to reduce some of the damaging projects that are happening internationally.
I mean, there's a really interesting balance on China's ledger. On the one hand, they talk about building a huge new fleet of coal power stations, not just in China but abroad. But at the same time, they have invested really heavily in renewable energy. In fact, it's thanks to China that solar and wind and batteries are so much cheaper than they were. And just to put that in context, a tenth of the price is what it costs for solar power now than it did just a decade ago. That is largely thanks to China. That is revolutionary in terms of the world's ability to tackle climate
Justin
change.
Rowlett, Yasmin Allah, Brian Brown, Thomas Keeling, thank you all very much. Thank you for joining us on Dateline London. More debate, same time next week. Goodbye.